Hey, welcome back to the React workshop where we're going to make our own Twitter clone with React. If you're following along in the notes, we're going to be doing the creating your first component section today, and we're going to be just wrapping up from where our previous video left off. So the first thing we should do is we're going to make our own component. As I've mentioned earlier, React is all about breaking up a complicated web app into multiple small components. If you're making a Twitter clone, a natural breakup component you might do is you'll make a tweet. So let's do just that. We're going to make a new file, and I'm just going to call it tweet.js, and we're going to put it, just for organizational reasons, in a folder called components. Now let's just quickly go over what exactly this code that we just said does. So as I mentioned in the last video, every single function that returns this weird JSX thing is kind of like it's a component, right? So in our case, so far, this is a super simple component. It's a div. It just says this is a tweet, not even that cool. And it has this style attribute. Last video, I mentioned that the style attribute works a little bit differently in JSX. So quickly, let's go over what that means. Instead of style being a bunch of strings that you can separate with colons and semicolons, in JavaScript with JSX, the style tag instead takes in this object. And the object is a JSON object. And it has a key value system. So the key is like the name of the CSS property, like border or padding. And then the value in a string is whatever you want the property to have. Key difference here is that they are camel case instead of dash case. So in CSS, it's like margin dash top, but here it's margin top like that. But other than that, just kind of works the way you expect, and you can plop it in here. So this entire thing is a super simple tweet component. Now we want to use this component in app.js. How do we do that? Well, in a programming method, right, you probably want to import this as a library or as a file. In JavaScript, in order to make something importable, you also have to export the thing. So here, we're saying export default tweet. That just means when we import something from this library, let's export this function or this component. So let's head back to app.js. I now want to import what we just wrote. I'm going to quickly delete this logo because we're not going to use it anymore. And here instead, I'll replace it with this import tweet from components tweet. This is just the file path. And notice that there's no .js here. We don't really have to have it. How do we use the component that we just wrote? That's a good question. Well, here we can just pop it in like this. And it looks a lot like your own custom HTML element, right? It's like a self-closing element right there. And look at that. This is our tweet. It's popped up. As you can see also, the CSS styles that we added, right, the border and the padding and the margin, which we'll see later, are working as intended. Here's the thing though, right? This is not that useful of a component. I could have just copy pasted what's in here and then put it over here. So what's one thing that we probably want from each of our components? Well, we probably want to give it information, right? We want to be able to say, hey, a tweet, probably has an author and a post. I want to be able to do something like this. Say, hey, the author is Matt, and the body says, Queer Hacks is awesome. We want this to somehow render on our screen over here. And this lets us abstract away to the end user of our component, right? How to actually code all of this stuff. Well, as it turns out, React lets us do exactly this. And you might think, oh, well, if a tweet is a function, maybe this is something that we'll take in as an argument. And that's totally correct. The technical term for this is a property, or props, in React. And out of convention, we're going to call it props. Props, then, just like arguments in normal functions in normal languages, is a variable, and we can access it. Let's take a look here, right? We have a prop called author, and we have a prop called body. So you might immediately think, oh, is one of these author or body, or is it a subfield of props? And you'd be correct, right? So props is actually going to be this one object that contains all of the properties passed to the component. So here we can access this object, and this is where we're going to use JSX again, right? So we can say props.author, and this takes the author property passed to the component, says, and then props.body. If we save and let Create React App do its thing, we can now see, hey, look at that. It worked. We were able to take in input from our app. And obviously, if we change this around, and change the author, React will kind of reflect that change for us automatically, which is super, super convenient. Okay, so as a quick recap, what we talked about, we made our own component, right? Which is super exciting. We talked about First of all, just how it's like the app component, but then we also mentioned how the style tag works a little bit differently in JSX than it does in CSS and HTML. Then we talked about exporting our component and then importing it in another file, which is what we did right here. We used our component, and last but not least, we talked about props, right? Which is how we can configure our component and make it a little bit more abstract and easier to use. In the next video, we're going to cover how to add interactivity to our components, which is super exciting and the big part of React. So I'll see you in the next video. Peace.